You're listening to Player Development, a channel focused on the intersection of sports and character growth. My guest today is Dr. Claire McKinney, a professor of gender studies at the College of W&M. Today we'll be talking about transgender participation in sports, the rules and new laws being proposed around that, and the cultural and societal impacts of such rules. Hey everyone, I'm here today with Dr. McKinney of W&M, and we're here talking about transgender participation in sports and some of the new rules and laws that are being proposed affecting that. So Dr. McKinney, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
So let's jump into a story that broke a couple weeks ago with the NCAA Women's Swimming Championships. In the 500-meter freestyle, transgender woman Lia Thomas won first place. And what happens in the NCAA Swimming Championships, from what I understand, is the top 16 advance to the finals. So she got first, and afterwards, Reka Gyorgy, a swimmer from Virginia Tech who placed 17th, so just one place out of moving on, wrote an open letter to the NCAA saying that their current rules disrespect biological females in this, with the spirit of competition and things like that. She said she respects what Lia Thomas does as a swimmer still, but that the NCAA rules are disrespectful towards biological females. What are your thoughts on what she said?
Yeah, so I think that this position is one that is a knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people have, right? So the idea is that there's an unfair advantage if you allow trans women to participate in sports that are designated for women. And I think that this it betrays a couple of really big problems, both with our cultural understanding of sports and how we're thinking about trans women and trans athletes. So in terms of the cultural understanding of sports, right, the story that we're not being told is, how did the 18th place, 19th place, 20th place person feel? How did the person who didn't make their swim team feel, right? And the reason why is because when we get reporting on sports, we always think about who is the champion, right?
Sure.
But the vast majority of people who participate in any sporting activity is not going to be a champion, right? Yeah. And so we rarely ask the question outside of news reporting, why do people participate in sports, right? The majority of people can't be doing it because they have a legitimate notion that they're going to make the top. Right? So the cultural meaning and importance of sports for the majority of folks who participate or who believe in it has to be connected to something else besides a real, sincere, and legitimate belief that you're going to win, right? And that means that we should look to, why do we value sports in the United States? And if you listen to people who talk about their current or former participation in sports, they'll talk about things like being able to excel their own personal best. They'll talk about the values of teamwork and camaraderie. They'll talk about the values that they found in discipline and being able to, give 100% of yourself. None of those require us to be honored, right? And so I think that there's an obsessive focus on winning and the value of competition to come from winning that actually doesn't really match with why it is that, culturally we value sports or socially why people participate in sports, right? Now, obviously, Gyorgy, is that how you say her last name?
As far as I know.
She's taking a different view, right? Which is, I would have been 16th had it not been for this woman's participation.
Sure.
I'm 17th, right? And this is another reason why I think that this is just a fundamental misunderstanding, both of trans athletes and what's going on in sports generally. First, right, as much as she protests that she respects Lia Thomas and other trans athletes, she fundamentally doesn't, right? Because Lia Thomas is a woman, and a woman ought to be able to participate in women's sports. Any other position disrespects and really is a form of indignity of Leah Thomas, right? And so it's one of those things where whatever you say before but is almost always irrelevant. So the preface may be well-meaning, but in the end, it is not actually what is going on, right? You cannot help but disrespect trans athletes when you say that they shouldn't be able to participate because they're trans. But the second problem is that the obsessive focus on this question of the difference between biological women and trans women really helps us ignore the wider ways that sports are fundamentally unfair, right?
Okay.
Meaning, think about what it takes to actually be highly competitive in sports. You have to have the time, the resources, and some degree of like natural acumen or talent in order to be good, right?
Yeah.
What if the person who's an 18th had to work a job while they were in college and so they didn't get to train as much as the next person? Why is that not an unfairness that we're talking about? Why isn't there a strict limit on the number of hours that you personally can swim, right? What if the person in 19th was 3 inches shorter than the person who got 16th, right? Why isn't there a height limit or, you know, for swimming, right, a wingspan limit? What if, you know, there are all these kind of other ways that we are not beginning on a level playing field. So the myth of the level playing field is what allows an obsessive focus on trans athletes being different and being different in a way that undermines fairness, when in reality, there are all sorts of unfairnesses that we just socially accept. And so the question is, why can't we, you know, if like accepting for a moment what I take a very problematic premise, that allowing trans women to participate is a source of unfairness.
Sure.
If we just accept that for a moment, why is that the unfairness that we're socially concerned about instead of other unfairnesses like who has access to the time, the resources, and other aspects of either physical acumen or bodily comportment that allows them to achieve, right?
So it's reductive to just focus on the trans feature when it's inherently imbalanced in any competition.
Exactly.
Because nobody's coming from the same background and the same.
Exactly. Nobody's coming from the same background. Nobody has access to the same resources. We know wealth and the ability to participate in a lot of sports are highly correlated. You know, these are not forms of unfairness that we are objecting to, right? We don't stratify participation in NCAA sports based on family income, for instance, even though that would probably create more overall fairness.
Could be.
So, you know, if we're not paying attention to actually creating all the artificial constraints of fairness, to single out trans athletes is really to engage in anti-trans aggression, right? Rather than doing anything to protect the sanctity of fairness in sports.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you for that introduction. As we jump in, I know this is, on the outside, probably a very complicated topic to talk about, especially with terminology that a lot of people aren't familiar with. So what are some terms that you feel like we should define before we go any further?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Oftentimes when we refer to trans athletes, what we're referring to is somebody who is transgender. That means that their gender identity does not match the identity that is assigned to them at birth, right? So oftentimes we'll hear the terms assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. And then we will refer to trans women or trans men. We may also hear terms like non-binary or gender queer. These categories tend not to make such an appearance in sports because sports is so bifurcated between two genders. But to be non-binary or gender queer means that you don't actually identify with being either a man or a woman, right? And so your gender identity could be fluid. It's more defined by things like masculinity and femininity. It means that, you know, the categories that we have just are, you know, they don't capture your own felt identity, right?
Okay.
On the other hand, we'll hear oftentimes in news reports this idea of being biologically female or biologically male. The more preferred term often in studies here is cis woman or cis man. And cisgender just means that your gender identity accords with the gender or the sex that you were assigned at birth, right? You may also hear the slippage between the terms gender and sex.
Right.
So there's both a popular way that this is understood, and then there's like the feminist theory side. I'm not going to get into the intricacies of feminist theory, but most of the time in popular discourse, when people are making a distinction between sex and gender, sex refers to what we take to be the biological markers of being a man or a woman, meaning we're talking about reproductive systems, we're talking about puberty, what happens at puberty, we're talking about hormonal levels, and we're talking about chromosomes, right? And so that's what people often refer to as sex.
Right.
Gender is referred to as the kind of social categories. So all the ways that we presume men and women act differently, right? So we can think about division of labor, the fact that in K through 12 education, more women than men are teachers. We can talk about, the gender wage gap. We can talk about all these markers of difference that don't necessarily have a biological origin.
Okay, right. And so I think one of the difficulties is that sports is ostensibly about the biological pieces that you talk about, chromosomes, DNA, which, to my knowledge, even hormonal therapy won't end up changing.
Right.
And so, how do we engage with that when, a lot of sports is about our bodies and how our DNA is expressed? Yeah,
so this is going to get us more into the feminist theory side of things. So bear with me.
That's fine. I brought it up.
So feminist biologists following the work of a woman, Anne Fausto Sterling, have demonstrated over decades that the idea that there are only two biological sexes and that we can cleanly distinguish between them is a myth, right? It is a social category that says there are only two biological sexes, right? And there are a couple of reasons why. So you saw how I mentioned all these different ways, right? Reproductive systems, hormonal levels, chromosomes, what happens at puberty, et cetera, all these different ways that we kind of categorize. What happens if they don't match, right? So what happens when somebody has XX chromosomes, but they have a condition that makes their body like immune to the effects of estrogen? Then they're not going to actually develop secondary sex characteristics of a woman. So are they a woman or are they a man, right? We can think about how people are born with XXY, right? That is, you can have 3 sex chromosomes and not just 2 sex chromosomes. We can talk about intersex people who are born with external genitalia that may not match internal reproductive systems. We can talk about variations of hormone levels. So hormone levels aren't, that all women have X amount of estrogen, all men have Y amount of testosterone. They're overlapping curves, right? So there are women who have more testosterone production than there are men that have that level of testosterone production. So there are all these ways that biologically we should think about, if we wanted to categorize, right? I think Anne Fausto Sterling begins with 6 different categorizations of sex. Many people now talk about a kind of spectrum of sex characteristics, right? And so the problem is that we've naturalized the idea that there are only 2 sexes biologically when biology actually doesn't conform to that, right?
I see.
So that's kind of one big complication. So then when we talk about like sports and how sports is about the body and what the body can do, you can see that that's imposing categories on a biological reality that doesn't exist, that doesn't conform to it. The second big issue is that we actually don't know how much any particular aspect of sex difference plays a role in the development of the capacity for strength, for endurance, for whatever else we are kind of measuring in sports competition, right? So again, right, we can talk in generalities that in general, men may be stronger than women, but there are women who are stronger than some men, right?
Absolutely.
Same thing with, endurance, same thing with speed, same thing with height. And so the science is not dispositive of how we ought to think about this, right? So we really have to think a lot more about where are the origins of sex distinction in sports, and are they still valuable? And is the way that we're playing sports, should the rules or the evaluation change if we wanted mixed gender sports? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And as you mentioned, talking about the rules around sport, let me just give a brief timeline of kind of what's been going on recently. So the NCAA and the Olympics have had rules about transgender participation. I don't know exactly how long that's been, but they do revolve around measuring testosterone levels and having been on hormonal treatment for a certain amount of time. And what's being proposed now in the US is that in December 2021, 10 states passed laws preventing trans athletes from participating in sports according to their gender identity. And 30 plus states have introduced bills, and at least 7 in the first week of 2022, that the language all seems very similar, that any publicly funded sport has to designate male, female, or men's, women's, or boys, girls, or co-ed sports. And participants have to participate based on what is assigned to them at birth, as you said. So to start with, I guess, my first question is, why are these laws being introduced, and especially why now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In my reading, most of these laws are less about any real material concern for people and the preservation of sports, and much more are part of a politically calculated move to capitalize on a current panic about transgender people and their visibility in public, and use this to mobilize voters, right? So if you recall, it wasn't that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that we were at the height of the bathroom bill, right? Kind of wave around the country, where states were passing laws that both banned localities from having non-discrimination policies that included transgender people, but also requiring that all people had to use public facilities that corresponded to their sex assigned at birth, right? And these bathroom bills, again, right, it was based on this moral panic that had no basis in reality, that it was kind of this notion that we had to protect cis women from the potential of male predators pretending to be women to get access to bathrooms, right? And so it was under this guise of stopping sexual violence against cisgender women. In reality, right, it's much more likely that trans people will be both victims of sexual violence and sexual assault, and the surveillance and policing of bathrooms heightens the danger, not just of trans people, but anybody who is not traditionally gender conforming, right? So people who look more masculine and are women, cis women, right, were being targeted for violence, but not just violence, but, verbal assaults in bathrooms because it was presumed that they did not belong there, right? So we also know, right, it's not that public restrooms are the primary site that sexual assault happens. Sexual assault is more often between intimate partners than anything else. And yet we do not see a new investment in thinking about how is it that we actually protect people from sexual violence and sexual assault. So there's a lot of good indications that the trans bathroom bills were nothing but a mobilization of anti-trans aggression in order to score political points.
I see.
I would say the exact same thing about what's going on with these anti-trans participation in sports bills, which is the sanctity of women's sports is not a top priority for any of these states. It's not as if, were it not for Title IX, we probably wouldn't even see women's sports in the majority of these states. The notion that there needs to be some sanctity protecting women's participation of sports is belied by the fact that there's not an investment either publicly or privately in really supporting the expansion of women's participation in sports.
Got it.
So what's going on here more than anything is I think it's really kind of low-hanging fruit that another easy way to attack trans people in order to score political points is by focusing on sports. Because again, you can tell a really simple narrative, right? The simple narrative being, we presume that trans athletes have an advantage. They don't have an advantage, but we presume they have an advantage. We presume there's going to be a flood of men who could not perform as well as they wanted to in their sports. They're going to claim falsely that they are women in order to get the gold medal in, women's sports, right? Not only is there no evidence that somebody is willing to switch their identity in order to win a medal, right? This relies on really harmful stereotypes that trans people are deceptive, right? That they are trying to fool people. These are lies, right? Trans people are living their gender identity and they are presenting themselves in the face of huge personal risks and costs as their, as their selves. And the fact that we are using these myths to once again kind of mobilize public sentiment to say, I'm going to vote for the person who is protecting young girls, just shows how much of this is really about being anti-LGBTQ folks.
I see. And as you bring up that parallel with the bathroom bills, a lot of the narrative translates to what we're hearing now, because ostensibly the laws are about protecting girls' sports and, whatever sanctity, purity of girls, women's sports. Why doesn't it work the other way? Like, they're trans men. Why is there no narrative about protecting boys' sports?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, and again, we can talk about bathroom bills. There wasn't a concern about women pretending to be men to get into men's bathrooms, right? There wasn't a discourse about trans men being a danger. So this goes to some of the more fundamental forms of sexism, right, in American society, which is there's not really a presumption that a trans man would, right, there's no benefit for a woman to pretend to be a man in sports because we presume women are weaker, less capable, right, don't have the capacity to compete with men, right? The whole presumption of why we need gender segregated sports is because women can't compete with men. Not that men can't compete with women, because the presumption is men would always win. Right. And so the fact that we don't have a discourse on trans men violating the sanctity of sports, and we don't even have a discourse, right, of women, people who are assigned female at birth, transitioning and yet still remaining in women's sports. That is, there's not a discourse of these assigned, whatever you're assigned at birth, that's the sport you have to play.
Right.
What about women, people assigned female at birth who are transitioning, taking hormones, et cetera, and are continually to compete with cis women, right? Trans men and cis women's sports are also not what we're talking about. So again, this kind of belies how much of this is kind of embedded in a broader social sexism that presumes naturally, biologically, women just can't compete.
Okay. And so the narrative reveals some of the stereotypes that are in play about this. And I think I can anticipate your answer, but do these bills accomplish any of their stated purpose?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a pretty easy no, right?
I figured.
when the governor of Utah recently vetoed the proposed bill banning trans participation in sports, he made very clear that the reason why he was vetoing it is because he did not want more suicides by trans kids, you know? And this actually reveals the cost of these bills. So not only do they not do anything to preserve the sanctity or purity of women's sports, they actually have a material cost, which is so much of the way that we find our ways in the world is to find something that gives us a sense of meaning and value.
Yeah.
And for a ton of kids, that's their participations in sports.
Sure.
And that doesn't change if you have a gender identity that most people don't understand. In fact, it's probably heightened because, you know, the idea that, you know, sports is a place where we feel that we have control over our body. We have a control over our environment, right? The rules help script how we're going to kind of engage with one another. All of those things can be hugely supportive for any kid, right?
Yeah.
And you could see if there's a mismatch between how people perceive your body and what you yourself see your body as, that becomes even more important. Banning kids from participating in sports because of their gender identity reinforces once again that they don't socially belong and that they can't have access to a site that has probably produced a lot of social meaning for them, right? And in that sense, I think these bills are hugely dangerous to making sure that people have, you know, the sort of spaces to actually develop as full human beings, right? So long as we're a culture that values sports and sports participation, banning a certain population from participating in it is to say that you cannot participate in American life.
I see. And and to clarify also that these bills are not on the surface keeping anyone from playing sports, but just that they have to participate with their assigned gender at birth. So I guess the counterpoint to that would be like, well, they can still play.
Right.
That's a but, yeah.
Yeah, so that's right. But if I know and affirm myself to be a man and I'm told that I have to play with women, or if I know and affirm myself to be a woman and I have to play with men, it is once again society saying the cost of your participation is denying a part of yourself that you find to be fundamental, right? And the damage done to saying somebody you have to pretend to be what you aren't, and you have to pretend so deeply that socially you're not recognized by others, right? Gender is hugely important in our society. And so to say you can't actually express your gender as it exists, again, right, does deep, deep damage to some people. And so this is, I mean, you're right. In my answer, I was kind of presuming that you weren't allowed to play. But in some senses, right, if you're not allowed to play as your gender identity, some people will go through that.
Right.
And because of the value that they place on sports, but having to damage a portion of yourself in order to do that is, I think, kind of deeply troubling. But for many others, right, it is actually kind of like a bar, which is it says you have to engage in psychological harm to yourself if you want to participate.
Yeah. And also knowing that so many athletes find a lot of freedom in their expression through sports that's not available to trans athletes who maybe have to abide by some of these bills that are passed into law.
Exactly. Yeah. That, you know, again, this goes back to the beginning of the conversation. The value that we find in sports is not that you get the gold medal, you get the gold ring, whatever else, right? The value that we find is in that kind of personal growth, in relationships with others, and being able to kind of like find a space of meaning and value. If the terms of that require you to either deny who you are or require you to do further psychological damage to yourself, that's a really sad state of affairs for how we think about sports participation and its value culturally.
Got it. So let me transition to some of what we've been talking about, the NCAA and the Olympics, and you talked about kind of the natural spectrum of testosterone and other sex hormones in the body. The way things currently stand with, having to go through hormone therapy for a certain amount of time, have a certain level of testosterone in your body or lack of, is that a fair way to set this standard? Because I guess there has to be some kind of way for them to set something, but is that the best way to do it?
So the problem with, well, I'll say a couple things. The International Olympic Committee has tried to kind of grapple with how do you maintain sex segregation almost from its inception, right?
Okay.
And so for a while it was physical inspections. For a while it was using what was called the bar body test, which the creators of the test said that you can't use it to determine sex identity. And so now testosterone is just like the next evolution of how we're trying to kind of regulate, right?
Sure.
So physical inspections have their issues. I think most
clearly.
prominently like a privacy issue of having to
absolutely.
expose your entire body. The bar body test, as I said, right, doesn't actually distinguish between sexes and the way that would meet our kind of natural language usage of sex difference. Testosterone has similar issues, but as a lot of people are pointing out now, has issues that especially raise the problem of race. So one of the things that we see with testosterone testing is that it becomes an issue. That is, the people who are picked to do testosterone testing are those who don't conform to social standards of female comportment and female beauty.
I see.
And so, right, the standout case of this is Caster Semenya, right, the African runner who throughout her career has, encountered massive skepticism of her and her body because she doesn't comport to, honestly, white standards of what it means to look like a woman, right? So it's not just her extraordinary performance, it's her physical attributes. Because these are white standards, the people who are most scrutinized are those who are non-white, right? And this isn't just true in international competition, this is also true in the United States, right?
Okay.
So we have to bring race into the picture and how skepticism of one's gender identity, even if one is not claiming to be trans, falls into the picture. And so why we focus on testosterone is it is a relatively easily measurable way for us to try and confirm our already present skepticism that somebody is not really a woman, right? So that's kind of the first problem. The Semenya case also shows us a lot of different ways that why testosterone levels are ultimately incredibly arbitrary, right? Which is the International Governing Committee for Track and Field set the levels basically right below a level that Semenya has never tested at, right? There's not a scientific basis for how much testosterone in the body, quote unquote, gives somebody an unfair advantage. Yet we see the levels being set in ways that are not actually, there's no real rigorous scientific support that above this level somebody has an unfair advantage. Why? Because unfair is not a scientific category. Right?
It's relative.
It's all relative. It's based on perception, and honestly, it's based on like what we presume should be the case. And so our standards are not free from bias.
And so, it's self-reinforcing.
Exactly. So even if we could show a direct correlation between testosterone level and a particular level of performance, we would still be making a social determination of what level of performance was too good for a woman.
I see.
Right? And so testosterone, I think, just like all these other measures, are already introducing a whole host of questions of why once again is it a sex characteristic that we're scrutinizing, not these social characteristics of class or body size or whatever else. But second, this all goes back to the determination of what we think is appropriate for women.
Okay.
right? And so it's not altogether clear either that testosterone is the main or only thing that matters, nor is it clear that regulating testosterone will create this kind of fictive level playing field.
Yeah.
And so I do know, the IOC in 2021 came out with a new framework that is not legally binding, but is kind of like, it has other principles, right? Like the right to privacy, like evidence-based determinations, like a presumption against unfair advantage, right? That the IOC is actually moving in a direction informed by trans athletes and their experience to say a lot of what our policies have been based on were based on stereotypes and based on prejudice rather than based on an actual evaluation of what preserves Olympic competition, right? The NCAA has done something not as radical. They still require testosterone testing, as you said, but they also, have devolved authority to the individual sport governing boards, right?
Okay.
And so the NCAA is not going to maintain what levels have to be enforced. This is going to be a determination sport by sport.
Okay.
And so, who knows how that's going to, this isn't enforced now. This is, I think, for 2023 or 2024, but who knows how this is going to unfold. But I do think that this is a recognition, at least by those organizations that govern sports, that they actually don't have the answer to these questions. And I think that's a little bit more honest than just presuming that either sex assigned at birth or that testosterone holds the key to fairness in sports.
Okay. Yeah. And, as you're talking, especially to your first point, it reminded me of almost after 9/11 when we started enforcing more screenings at the airports, but it was informed by people's stereotypes of what a terrorist looked like.
Absolutely.
And so the people who don't fit what we think are safe end up being tested, targeted more.
Exactly. No, I think it's a great analogy, right? That we have there's a collective sense, but built on stereotype and belief and not reality of what are the kind of clear boundaries of what is acceptable in society. And then once you're outside of that, and often, race is one of the main ways that we kind of have available to police these sort of things. It marks people out for increased scrutiny and attention. And again, not in ways that are not damaging, right? Because, Caster Semenya is the poster woman for how this unfolds, but for every Caster Semenya, there are hundreds of other girls who are being scrutinized because they don't appear to be, typically a white standard of what it means to look like you're a woman.
I see.
And that skepticism, again, deeply damaging to somebody's kind of psychological self. And when it's connected to sports and something that somebody finds really deep social meaning in, you can see how that's a devaluation of the self.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that covers all of the questions that I have for you, Dr. McKinney.
Great.
What are some closing thoughts that you have about all that we've covered today?
Yeah, honestly, I think that this is going to be continuing as an issue, as are other forms of anti-trans legislation, so long as trans visibility continues to increase, right? The flip side of that, though, is that there are more and more resources for trans kids and trans adults to find community, to find support. And as we move forward, I think that's also going to kind of continue to push our social boundaries, that even when we're thinking about sports, we're going to see rethinking about what competition is and what it requires. We may even see a rethinking about how we design the rules of evaluation of sports so that we don't rely so much on sex segregation in order to define sports participation. So, I think that there are reasons for us to continue to kind of push against dominant narratives that reinforce anti-trans stereotypes. But I think with a lot of the leadership of trans athletes, trans activists, we're going to see the capacity for society to transform, to make more spaces of acceptance.